Hello and welcome to this video tutorial. I'm Ron Vellen, and this is part 2 of our discussion on perception. In this video, we focus on two main things. The first one is framing and working with frames or mental frameworks during a negotiation. And then we also look at the 12 cognitive biases. So let's begin with framing. What is framing? The best way to think of this is to imagine that we see the world through a frame. Before we talked about a filter, and this is part of that filter. So let's imagine that we live our lives by looking through a frame at the world. And we see things, our opponents, through that frame. We also see the issues through a frame. We can also see the interests through a different frame. But really, when it comes to interests, they actually help us understand the frame. So our interests in a negotiation, our interests that revolve around the main issues, will look one way, and our opponent's interests will look somewhat different likely. And those interests help us understand their frame as well, although it does not paint the whole picture. So the main thing when it comes to framing is that we're looking at the issues mostly. So how do we see the issues that are being negotiated? What is the official definition of a frame? A frame is the subjective mechanism through which people evaluate and make sense out of situations, leading them to pursue or avoid subsequent actions. So as I said a moment ago, framing lives in the filter. That same filter discussed in the part 1 video. The elements that make up the filter form a frame, in other words. So it's not the only thing that the filter is doing, but the framing is important. What you're basically asking is, how do I see the world? And how does my opponent see the world? And in a negotiation specifically, how am I seeing the cluster of issues, or even the individual issues on their own? And how is my opponent seeing them? Likely you've heard of the analogy of the glass half full or half empty. Okay, let's have water in our glass here. Well, is the glass half full or half empty? Whether you see it one way or another, this is the example of a frame. If you see the glass as half full, which tends to mean that you see things as more positive, then if you go into a negotiation with a glass half full mentality, you're going to be seeing it as full of opportunity and potential. If you go into a negotiation with the attitude or perspective or frame that the glass is half empty, you'll probably come into the negotiation more skeptical and likely less hopeful that negotiations can go smoothly and lead to a great result. Now, this is just one of millions of examples we could come up with, but that's basically it. And the other thing to remember about a frame is that they emerge and converge as the parties talk about their preferences and priorities. This is where understanding interests becomes valuable, because it helps us see the overall perspective the person has as they are able to share perhaps elements of their interests. Or even if they don't do it completely, at least you'll get a bit of a hint at it that'll start to show you how they're seeing this whole scenario that you're working on. So keep this in mind. We all have frames about how do we see the world, and we'll have a frame in the negotiation and every negotiation we have. If the frame around a negotiation that we have generally is that every time I negotiate, there's a winner and a loser, and I'm going to be the winner here. Or maybe your frame is negotiations are tricky and everyone's out to get me, and I never have any luck in a negotiation. That's a frame as well. Now, these are broad frames. Maybe you have a frame that every negotiation is an opportunity. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But if you have the main idea in your head, your frame, that it's an opportunity for both parties to get creative and find really helpful, mutually beneficial solutions, that's a different frame too. As I said, these are just examples of broad frames we may have. In negotiations, we will have specific frames that emerge. We'll probably have a frame around all of the issues as a cluster, then we'll have perhaps a separate frame for each issue. But generally speaking, you'll see a connection that someone will have between the issues in one frame, sort of how they see the negotiation. And if you can understand that frame, it will help you actually, especially in an integrative situation, get to a more creative, likely more fulfilling and more complete solution and agreement. Like with things that we perceive or our conflict handling style or anything else that we learn about ourselves, nothing is good or bad on the surface. It's a question of what works well for us and what is not working well. There is no magic formula. Whatever frame you have is fine. Just be aware of it and ask questions like, is this frame helping us get to a good solution? If it is, great. If it isn't, ask yourself, why not? And explore it. Likely you don't have to change the entire frame, especially if it's focusing on one particular issue. Maybe you just need to modify it a little bit or get more information to see things in a different way that will lead to a more constructive outcome. Let's look at a more detailed example just to flesh this out completely, and then we'll move on and discuss cognitive biases. In this example, we're preparing for the outbreak of an unusual new disease. This is an example taken from the book. Coincidentally, or maybe not so, at the time of this recording, we're still dealing with the late stages of COVID-19, but this is not about COVID-19. So the country's preparing for the outbreak of an unusual new disease. It's expected to kill 600 people. Not great news, certainly. Which program would you favor? Each group has a choice to make between two programs. And this is hypothetical, of course, but it doesn't matter. And each group is exposed to the problem in a different frame. So group one, they have a choice between program A, 200 lives saved. Don't forget that's 200 out of 600. Program B, 1/3 probably all saved, and 2/3 probably none saved. In group two, they choose between program A, where 400 will die, and program B, 1/3 probability all saved, and 2/3 probably none saved. Now, if these sound like they're similar, they are, but the language used is quite different. So let's look at what the results were. I'm just going to put this over here. In group one, 76% chose program A and 24% chose program B. Now, program A said 200 lives saved, which means 400 die. Program B is 1/3 probably all saved. Again, that's 200 lives, and 2/3 probably none saved. So 76% chose the one that sounded more positive, and 24% chose the one that sounded a little less so. In program B, 13% chose program A. That's the definitive 400 people will die. Same numbers, nothing has really changed, just how it's phrased. And 87% chose program B. 1/3 probably all saved and 2/3 probably none saved. That's exactly the same language as group A was exposed to. The difference is the 200 lives saved in program A for group one and 400 dying, which is the language used for group two. This is a more specific illustration of the glass half full, half empty frame. So this gives you a sense of how our perspectives are altered by how we frame something. It doesn't change the data, it doesn't change the numbers. The issues are the issues in a negotiation. What changes is how we see them, and how we see the issues will affect how we approach them and negotiate them with our opponent, as will the opponent's frame. One last thing just to keep in mind, and this is a small point but does come up in a negotiation. Framing affects the reference point, defined as an arbitrary point used to evaluate an alternative as whether it's a gain or a loss. And this is just a complex way of saying how we see something as beneficial or a win, or how we see something as not beneficial or harmful or a loss. It's just a reference point we create in our mind. And so be aware of the frames you have. going to any negotiation, and specifically the frames you have around the issues. And this will help you become a stronger negotiator and be less impacted by the different frames of your opponent. And now in the last part on framing, we're going to look at the 4 main types of frames that exist in negotiation. The first one is called an outcome frame. This outcome frame is about those who have a frame of mind that the issues and outcomes are everything. So they want the best deal on the outcomes related to the specific issues that are being negotiated, and don't pay as much attention to the other elements, the other parts of the process, and so on. And if you encounter somebody who has a focus on an outcome frame, it's really important to understand where that's coming from. And if you use some skill, they will start to reveal some of their interests in those outcomes, even though that might not be a conversation they're focused on having, i.e. the one about interests. Next is the aspiration frame. And this one is all about interests. So you may negotiate with someone, or you may have this frame yourself. Aspiration frames are about understanding what is behind the outcomes that people want. And often when you meet someone who has a very strong aspiration frame, they'll ask a lot of questions about what's important to you, and they love to get into the dialogue about interests in a very thorough and open way. They're also likely to share the information about their interests as well. They often will ask questions that go beyond interests, just to get more and more context. I know I have some of this quite a bit. It depends on the negotiation. One thing to note here is that someone could be working with more than one frame, and they'll shift back and forth. That's the important thing about frames, is that there can be more than one at play. Rare is it all in one moment, but over a longer negotiation, you will see frames come in and out depending on what they're working on and what part of the negotiation and what their natural tendencies are. The next one is the process frame. This frame is focusing on the process of negotiation itself. So if you're negotiating with somebody who has a very present or strong process frame, they're interested in the process of how the negotiation is going to take place, the logistics, ethical discussions, principles, the guidelines that are set for the negotiation. This typically shows up more prominently when the negotiations are complex, often multi-party, will likely take place over time. You can think of examples that involve labor union and management negotiations for salaries, for wages. These things typically take time. Perhaps in the resource industry where there's mining or oil drilling or logging or something along those lines, where you might have a local community involved with the negotiation, different levels of higher government, the company or companies involved, other organizations, maybe NGOs that are concerned about how the environment is being treated. These kinds of things go on all the time. And so when you have complex negotiations, the process frame becomes important to be sure that you have a negotiation process that works. And the last one is the identity frame. And this pertains to somebody's identity, how they see themselves. Now you might be asking, how is this a factor in a negotiation? Well, it might have something to do with their cultural background, their demographic background, affiliations they have, anything that connects to how they see themselves or how they identify. And how this might affect a negotiation is if they're affiliated with a particular group, they may see themselves as being a voice for that group, even if it's not a specific issue that relates to the group specifically. In other words, it may not be a human rights issue or some kind of fair treatment issue or an inclusion issue, but perhaps the negotiation itself is something that they feel they have to put forward a representation or identity around so that they can see the end agreement being fair in the eyes of who they are accountable to or who they feel they represent. So we're going to make a shift now and discuss the 12 cognitive biases in negotiation. These biases are really important to understand. In part 1, we discussed the 4 main perceptual errors and how they live in our perceptual filter. Well, the cognitive biases have a relationship with that filter as well. By and large, these biases are born out of the same place that is the home to our perceptual filter. They help us to understand patterns of how we behave if we're initiating something in a negotiation, and how we react when somebody else is doing something. And a lot of the reasons for the behavior and the responses live in the unconscious. So this is another way for us to become more aware of where our biases exist and when do they exist, what are the conditions. And in this specific context, we're talking about negotiation circumstances. The book calls them systematic errors. Now let's look at the 12 cognitive biases that we're discussing. They are irrational escalation of commitment, mythical fixed pie belief, anchoring and adjustment, issue framing and risk, availability of information, the winner's curse, overconfidence, the law of small numbers, self-serving biases, endowment effect, ignoring others' cognitions, and reactive devaluation. So we're going to go through and explain all 12, and for each one we're going to provide a brief example. But don't be concerned, this is not going to take a lot of time. We're just going to clearly explain it and provide an example that hopefully brings it to life for you. So let's begin. The first 2 we're going to look at are irrational escalation of commitment and mythical fixed pie beliefs. Irrational escalation of commitment is very similar to a term called sunk cost. What's going on is during a negotiation, negotiators can sometimes get hung up on following through on a course of action, a commitment they've made to some kind of outcome or some kind of approach to an outcome that starts to look a bit irrational. And there are a couple of reasons why this might take place. First of all, what does it look like? Perhaps your opponent keeps hammering on one particular way of crafting an outcome. Maybe they're really hung up on dollars all the time, and they feel that by pushing on dollars and dollars, even though there are other important issues, this is something that they really feel is the way to go. And they may realize after a while that where they're pushing on getting the best price or the best service contract or whatever it is you're working out, that they're missing the bigger picture, and they may actually end up losing money. And if you're doing an integrative negotiation where you would be having these conversations, it may start to look like somebody's trying to save face. Maybe during the negotiation, they spent a lot of time on this particular element of cost, and you want to be able to reach a great agreement, but they're stuck on this one approach that costs everything, even though you can see that there might be ways that they can get an even better deal if they look at other elements of what you're actually working on, maybe focusing on some of the other issues. We need to also be careful of this tendency in ourselves too, especially if we're in a group or doing a team negotiation, and teams can convince themselves of something and keep going down a path, and you can get the whole team involved in this irrational escalation of commitment. So be mindful of this and all of the 12 cognitive biases and their potential to arise in yourself, not just seeing it in your opponent. Mythical fixed pie belief. This is quite straightforward. Negotiators assume that all negotiations, not just some, involve a fixed pie. In other words, this is win-lose. At best, it results in compromise. And remember that compromise is second best to collaboration. This serves as a reminder that in integrative negotiation, you're looking to collaborate and be creative. Compromise is the cutting the lemon in the half analogy. It is splitting the difference, but it doesn't mean you're both getting the maximum possible benefit out of the agreement. So the mythical fixed pie belief idea is that every negotiation, there is a fixed pie that cannot be expanded. We can't be creative. We've got to deal with the resources as they are, and I got to get mine. This is the emphasis on claiming value that we talked about in a previous video. And so keep in mind that if you notice that in somebody, it may take some dialogue to explore ways to expand the pie. And maybe you'll be able to convince someone to look at other options if they see that there's a chance to get more out of the deal. They will probably just need to be reassured that that is possible. The next two are anchoring and adjustment and issue framing and risk. Anchoring and adjustment relates back to things we've discussed in another video around anchoring itself, which refers to an opening offer and an initial counter offer. So what it does is creates an anchor on one side and an anchor on the other. And the space between is the range that's created by the opening offer and counter offer. This is not the same as bargaining zone, which is the space between resistance points. So you set up this anchor, and what we do is we do adjust whether there's a lot of foundation for an initial offer or a counter offer. They're taken as real, and a lot of this happens unconsciously. Sometimes if the opening offers or asking prices are very high or seem way out of an accepted range, they may just get dismissed. But that's not always the case. So often what happens is we accept it as being real, at least on some level. And that's why psychologically it plays on our minds and says, here is the range we're dealing with. Even if you discard one of those points, one of those anchors, it still leaves like a mental residue and will encourage negotiating between those two extreme points. So the adjustment is that. So this is a cognitive bias because it does have an effect on us. Don't overreact if you're a buyer and somebody starts with a very, very high price. Just treat it like, oh, the person is just trying to anchor in a very extreme way, and just give yourself some self-talk about how can I respond to this and get back to working on the negotiation. Issue framing and risk. We've just talked about framing, so I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail. Just keep in mind how you see a situation, the frame you look through at the situation, at the negotiation, or different issues within the negotiation will alter all of your other perceptions. And your perceptual errors will inform your frames at the same time. So it's a bit of a loop. Just pay attention to what kind of frame you see coming up during a negotiation, and just pay attention to it and acknowledge it. Next up is availability of information and the winner's curse. Availability of information. This operates when information that is presented in vivid or attention-getting ways becomes easy to recall. So if you present a point of view or perspective in a negotiation that is well illustrated and can be recalled easily, that's going to give it more power. At the same time, the information you have or have access to may be subject to this cognitive bias. Now, why is this a cognitive bias? That's because often the information that we have at hand is not complete. So we have to be careful with this and make sure that the information we have available is good information, not just stuff that we can recall easily. And that's the thing that happens when people present things well. It can be so powerful and yet be skewed in one way or another. During a negotiation, be careful of the information presented to you by your opponent, and be careful of the information that you are recalling from research you would have done in preparation for your negotiation. And so remember that availability of information. We will reach for the thing that we remember most vividly and most clearly. Watch for signals coming from our opponent, the things that we recall, things that we get hooked into, and always put it in kind of a mental file of a yes, and there could be more information here that we don't know. Winner's curse. We know this is the tendency to settle quickly on an item and then subsequently feel discomfort about a win that comes too easily. This is a very common situation. And I have kind of a rule of thumb. Whenever I'm selling something, if it's a product or my own coaching services or whatever it is, if there's a negotiation involved, I always want to make sure the person I'm negotiating with, whether it's an opponent like in a buy or sell situation or a client, that they feel that they have won something in some way, that they feel they had to earn their outcome, and that I don't settle so easily and so quickly that they start to have regret. If a negotiation win comes too quickly or too easily, we might start to wonder here, should I have asked for more? Is there some kind of deceit going on? Am I actually getting the best possible deal? So even if we have a target that seems aggressive or seems really, really good, if the person says, yes, great, let's just sign the deal, I would slow it right down and go, wait a minute, this was too easy. What's going on here? So I always recommend, if you are negotiating and the deal comes very, very quickly, just to slow things down and double check that everything is on the up and up. If you are selling something or if you're negotiating something in the seller type role, always make sure that your opponent feels that they really had to earn it. Don't get so excited and don't move too quickly to close the deal, because it may actually turn back on itself. It's possible that the person will renege on a deal because they're suspicious that it got done too quickly. So be careful of that. The next two we're going to look at are overconfidence and the law of small numbers. Overconfidence bias, the tendency of negotiators to believe that their ability to be correct or accurate is greater than is actually true. Overconfidence bias often shows up after a string of successful negotiations. So if you feel you're a strong negotiator and you find the deals kind of go in your favor all the time, whether they're simple buy-sell transactions or more complex, you're going to develop a winning streak, or at least something that feels like a winning streak, because you thought you did a great job all the way through. And maybe you did. But one thing I've learned over the years is there's always more to learn. And we have to be careful here of blind spots. This is what happens. We get overconfident. With overconfidence comes perhaps not researching things as well, perhaps feeling that our opponent's needs aren't as important, which comes up when we do integrative negotiation or mutual gains, mutual interest negotiation. It may mean that we overlook certain things that may cost us. We know with sports teams that if the team becomes overconfident, maybe they won't practice as hard, maybe they won't play quite as hard, and they can be caught off guard because we can sometimes get complacent. So watch out for blind spots. Be careful of feeling overconfident. Realistically confident is good. In other words, confidence is great. Overconfidence is dangerous. The law of small numbers is all about drawing conclusions from small sample sizes and limited experience. So similar to availability of information bias, in fact, I would say this is a cousin of information availability, we have to be careful with the information we have when we have a limited sample size of information, be it data, experience, any information that we gather. We have to make sure that we don't draw conclusions too quickly. This includes information given to us by our opponent during the negotiation. Slow things down, double check that your data has validity, and then carefully draw conclusions if you know for sure that the data is accurate. The other part of this that I mentioned earlier, that it has to do with limited experience, will also impact how we perform in a negotiation. So if we have always negotiated, let's say in a distributive manner, just focusing on compromise, we may engage with a more complex integrative negotiation and be blindsided because our experience actually is more limited than we realized, even if we had some success. So you can see how sometimes these cognitive biases can team up or combine. The law of small numbers could lead to overconfidence bias. It could also be connected to availability of information. Maybe your sample sizes are small because you didn't bother doing any more research, or you didn't ask somebody else's opinion on how you're doing in a negotiation. And so be careful of this cognitive bias, because like overconfidence, it will create blind spots for you. Next up, self-serving biases and endowment effect. Self-serving bias. There's a simple principle here, and I want to try to keep it as simple as possible. Say, for example, we have two people. You or I are person A, okay? It's person A. And over here, we have person B. Self-serving bias says, for situations that are negative, i.e. behavior that is not great, somebody being late for a meeting or something, we will conclude that the causal factors for this person's negative behavior are personal, i.e. internal. Something about their personality, their psychology, whatever it is the cause. When the circumstance is positive, we will assume that there could have also been some external factor at play. So let's take an example. Someone's late for a meeting chronically. We will tend to jump to a conclusion, without any other information we'll do this, that the person may be lazy or not considerate or they don't take the meeting seriously, whatever it is. If they are constantly bringing treats to a meeting or are always early or always really well prepared, we will think about their personal attribute, and we may also think about some external factor that is helping them to do this or causing them to do this. We might wonder if someone asked them to do it or told them to do it. Or we might even assign a negative character trait or personality trait to the person that they're doing it to make themselves look good in front of their boss, or they live close to the building so it's easy for them to get there. That's what's going on when we're evaluating somebody else. And again, this is minus real information for the behavior. We're just jumping to a conclusion. For ourselves, what we tend to do is when it's negative, it's the circumstance. It's an attribute that's external to us. You might say, oh, I'm late to meetings because the traffic was really bad when I drove, or the bus was late, or whatever it is. We will assign something in our own minds to make it seem to ourselves, and possibly justifying it to other people, that something got in the way. For positive things that happen to us, we tend to do the opposite. We will refer back to our internal or personal qualities to explain our behavior, both to ourselves and sometimes to other people. And we're not talking about people who are being magnanimous and saying, well, our team really did a great job, and nor are we necessarily saying that someone's being really egotistical. This is about a bias we have mentally to protect ourselves from our own bad news, if you will. So this is more prominent when the circumstances are negative. So negative behavior in somebody else, it's a personal or internal quality. Some kind of negative behavior from us will more easily assign an external cause for it. Endowment effect, straightforward and simple. We overvalue something simply because we own it. That might be skills, access to resources, whatever that is. You see this all the time when people are selling something, maybe on Craigslist or eBay. Maybe they've owned whatever the item is for a long time. Maybe it's a family heirloom, or maybe it's their own car that they kept clean, or a piece of equipment that they've owned for a long time. The same thing happens in any negotiation. Your own position, your own interests, your own assets or resources that you have to offer, we have a tendency to overvalue them simply because they belong to us. And that's really the only reason, and it is a big blind spot. We're not completely unconscious to this, but we need to be more aware. And this has a direct connection to reactive devaluation, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Our last two cognitive biases are ignoring others' cognitions and reactive devaluation, which I just mentioned. Ignoring others' cognitions, this is simply failure to consider others' cognitions, others' insights, ideas, thinking processes, which makes things a little simpler for us. But as we know with good negotiation planning, we need to think about what our opponent is going to be doing, how they might approach a negotiation, and try to understand how they move through the negotiation while it's happening. Listen to what they're saying, and you will be better off in the long run. It's simpler if you don't, but it's a blind spot. And the last one, reactive devaluation. This is simply devaluing the other party's concessions, the things they contribute to the negotiation, where they give in, where they contribute to the agreement, simply because the other party made them or offered them. So again, we need to be able to see beyond our own mental fence, outside of our filter, and take into account how, when it comes to reactive devaluation, we can demonstrate a better understanding and a more communicated valuing of our opponent's contributions to the negotiation. In the end, it's better in this way so that you can build the relationship in a much stronger way. If you continually devalue what the person's doing and how they're contributing, you're going to have difficulty with the working relationship, and it may backfire. Keep in mind that this often occurs when we don't like the other person. Maybe we know them in some other context. Maybe we don't respect them. It doesn't really matter what the reason is. Just be mindful that this will be a bias that will influence you possibly negatively because it tends to have an emotional charge. The last thing to mention here is a bit of advice from the book. Be aware of the negative aspects of these biases. And as you are more aware of them and how you are influenced by them, they will have less effect on you. It's kind of like shining the light on something in the dark. Understanding their unconscious drivers and roots will help you have a more relaxed and more powerful negotiation experience. If you're in a group, it's good to discuss them in some kind of a structured manner with your own team and potentially with counterparts if you see it happening, and you might want to bring it out as something that might be working against the negotiation. But we have to be careful because we might not be perceiving things accurately, but it's always good to see. If someone always puts down or devalues what you're saying or how you're contributing to the negotiation, that's worthwhile being talked about. So that's it for perception.